Welcome aboard and thanks for coming. This is Dartan Beck from daz3d.com, and we're going to take a quick look at some of the easy automated lighting that's set up in Carrara. Carrara comes with some great presets to look at for lighting examples, and so if you see anything that you like in sky or landscapes, space. Now here we have indoor, and it's pretty known to be somewhat difficult to get really good indoor lighting techniques going, and these are great examples on how to get something decent set up. Okay, we've got lighting scenes. Even though the category might not say anything about lighting, but in order for them to show up in Carrara at all, they have to have some kind of lighting. But these ones that are directed towards lighting are really good examples, as are these others. So I just wanted to mention that for those who are new. And enough of that. Let's get something going and set up this test bed. Go File, New, and we're going to start with a new medium scene and an empty scene. And I'm going to get out of this camera, go to Director's Camera, and make this one so that I can't see it. And I'm also going to show the production frame. All basic stuff. If you have any questions about any of that stuff, just hit me up at the Carrara Discussions Forum at Daz3D. I also like to insert a target helper object right away so that I can get my camera moved around to where I like it, but that's not necessary, especially here, because I'm going to go ahead and load in a copy of Genesis. Because there's some things that I'd like to quickly go over about that too, because whenever you're considering working with lighting, you should also keep in mind that you'll be working with shaders too, because shaders and lighting together are everything. Let's set up the camera right away. I just typed 0 on the target helper object, and something like this would be okay. And I also want to have him standing on something, and we'll just use a plane. Should actually be using an infinite plane, and perhaps I'll switch to that in a second, but right now let's finish optimizing this scene. Get out of this camera because we know we got it aimed somewhat right, and I want to change the shaders that are on Genesis, and I'll show you why here. As it looks a little bit like plastic, and when I'm working with when you get closer in here is where you start to see the shines. And now we're still with the default light, default camera, default shaders, and we have a bunch of shaders in here. But aside from eyelash and default, the rest of these are all identical. It's all that same white. So let's just consolidate that, remove unused masters, and consolidate duplicate shaders. And the one that gets left behind is lip. I'm just going to change that to clay. Just leave it as lip. What's the difference? But I'm going to edit that right away. And what we're focusing on for this exercise is we like this light gray color. Maybe you don't. I'm fine with the lack of bump on this, but it's the highlight and shininess channels that I want you to focus on. Increasing shininess does just that. So if we bring that down to 0, you see what it did to that ball up there? Right there you don't see really much of anything. That's because there's no detail on it. But if you crank that down, you'll start to see shines. Okay, if you crank it down to 0, what it's doing is it's evening out that light, and there's too much of it. So I'm going to bring that down, not quite that much, maybe 4.35. Bring this up to tighten it up a little bit better than perfectly even, and do a quick little test render, and that's not bad. What I want to do with the highlight being up at all, a common technique is that people will make that black, and I think the biggest reason why is it's most forgiving for lighting then, because it's not showing off much. See what I mean? It's just bland. There's no highlight. But if we crank that up just a little bit, just under 5 or around 5 is plenty for this type of thing. Otherwise, you'll start to get it to look too wet or too glossy. You're just too blown out. And we may even decide to lower the intensity on that light. Also, I kind of like to see this figure standing in something other than that T pose. And I also don't like these bones. To turn off the bone visibility, you can go to each bone individually and deselect display wireframe when attached. That's not fun, as it seems Carrara has to stop and think every time you deselect one of those. So it's a long, tedious process, especially with the fingers and all the little, and you have to get everything. Instead of doing that, I made a kind donation to Fenric for this wonderful tool. I just leave everything at its default when actor is selected, and bam, they are gone. And that's a one-way street. You can run that tool again and it won't give you the bones. So basically it's only intended to remove bone visibility. Enough on that. We have a, let's see, we have a clay shader. We have 2 planes. We have a default scene, default render settings, I believe. So this is the next place we'd like to attack. I'm not sure about you. I always put on full ray tracing. For now I'm going to leave anti-aliasing at fast, object accuracy at 2, shadow accuracy at 4, and leave the filter sharpness alone. I want to use global illumination in this practice, and I want to also experiment with indirect light, but not right now. And before I forget, I want to deselect interpolation. I don't really have any transparency going on in my scene, so I'm not going to worry about that. And sometimes I don't really want indirect lighting to worry about that either if the only transparency I have in my scene is hair, because for one, I won't need the indirect lighting to pass through all of the transparency in the hair, and for another, I don't want it to. It's just gonna bog down the system unnecessarily. I'm also going to change the irradiance map from calculated every frame to 1 for all frames, which is suggested for static scenes like it says here. But now if I want to use this for animating, I have to remember to put it back to calculated every frame, or I'm going to get artifacts from the fact that we would be using only 1 irradiance map rather than 1 for each frame, which is what is necessary for a proper animation. Okay, for now I'm just going to leave accuracy at 16. Like I'm saying, this is supposed to be a way of experimenting quickly. So we don't want to slow down our render, but we do want to use these tools, so it's going to slow it down, but we want to keep that to a minimum. So we're going to keep this stuff at default. The one thing that I'm going to change for mine is I'm going to use gamma correction. If you're going to use gamma correction, you want to set that up right now, right at the very beginning. Oops. Because if you change that later, then you should really go back and change all of your lights and everything like that. So it's always good to start off with that if you're going to use that. Okay, and I am. Okay, let's just do a quick test render on what we have so far. And the global illumination, even though it doesn't have much to work with, has already done, it looks like it's done some good already. Let's prove that and go Control R, and then I'll deselect this, and we'll render it in a new window, and we'll compare. And although it hasn't done, oh, maybe it didn't do anything much. It shouldn't really have had the opportunity to do much. I can see that it made this shadow less solid. It's more of a gradient because the global illumination is working, and it's very good. It's just that we don't have anything for it to really work with now except for one light. But what it needs to work is information around the subject, some sort of scenery, which can be anything. What's really neat about that is that anything could be as simple as a background color, just for an experiment, because that's what this whole thing is all about anyway. Let's just make that red. And now we have a background color of red. And let's just say that we don't want to see that red background in the render, so we'll also give it a backdrop of black, and we'll make this plane. I'm just going to delete it because when I want to use a plane, I'm going to put an infinite plane in. Now check this out. We're not going to see the red in the background at all. Global illumination is turned off. I'll just hit Control R. Boy, that's set too small. Get rid of these. Now we'll do Control R, or tap the button, and see what that does. It contributes to the lighting. So if we instead use something like a bigradient, you're getting some nice global illumination. We'll leave that set like that, but now that I'm in the director's camera, we'll bring ourselves closer and just use this since it's working so quickly. Now, what I like to do with this type of experiment is I'm basically trying to paint with shadows. So I'm looking at the shadows more than anything. I'm really liking the it's totally blown out right now, but let's maybe do something about that. Here, this guy's cool. Make it an undead fiend. Okay, and what I'm doing is just giving some detail that can be included in the shadows to look at. So what does that give us? Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lower these arms. It gets annoying seeing them out in that T pose. And you can see that just with this default light that comes with a default scene. If you bring one in from insert, it points straight down. But the default scene comes with a pretty decent angle for the default location that content comes in at. You know, that's not a really bad shadow line. It may not be perfect. It may not be what you're looking for at all. But now let me just quickly, wrong one. Quickly change that a little bit, just because it bothers me. All right, that's good. Now I'm going to show you a trick. We're going to right click and choose head, and then we're going to shift select light, and I'm going to hit Control K, and that brings up the align menu. On Mac it would be Command K, and it starts off with only the y-axis selected, so we want to select the other two, leave everything else at default, and hit OK. And when you have time to mess around a little, you might want to try some of these other options in here. Neat tool, neat to know. And now I've just aligned the light to the head, because when I'm doing all of this test rendering, I don't want to keep bouncing out to where this light is, and I don't need it that big either. Alrighty. So for this experimentation, what I'd like to have you consider is just using a single light and practice with aiming that one light with global illumination turned on or off and working with your shadows. As a matter of fact, when you're just playing around with the angles, you can go ahead and turn off the global illumination, and it makes it that much faster. And you can also use soft shadows when you want, but for this experiment I would appreciate it if you leave the soft shadows off, because we want to see the full effect of the shadows, exactly what they're doing, because what I want to point out is that shadows are very important in an image. So you want your shadows cranked up to 100%. I'm going to bring this level down a little bit since we seem to have a pretty bright scene going on right now. No, I think I'm just going to leave everything. I might make this just a little bit darker. Yeah, whatever. I think it was nice before. I'll go back in there. Oops, this one. We'll Control Z. And there we go. Okay. So, what we are doing, let's get rid of the bigradient. Get rid of the backdrop. And look at what's happening. Oh, do I have an ambient on? I do. Oh, that's got to go. That's why the shadows are so lost. But now that's a good thing to bring up right now, is an inexpensive way to simulate indirect light is to use this ambient setting. And basically what it does is it applies light according to this, well, it basically applies this color on everything. It brightens up from underneath with no regard to what's in the way. So for lighting experiments or good light practice, you don't want to use that. Okay, now let's look, and we should have some pretty black shadow. That's what I was trying to get at before. And now when you keep it like that and select your light, it makes it a little bit easier to see what your shadows from that one light are doing, and eventually you get really used to these particular angles. You know what they look like according to where your film camera is. Zoom him in a little. Okay, so there's our test bed, and now we're going to turn global illumination back on. Do it again. And you can see there's not a big change because there's nothing to interact with. So now we can turn on our background again to a bigradient, and this is just leaving it at default right now, but you can change all of these different colors. The two middle ones are the far horizon as far as your eye can see, and then this darker blue is straight above your head, and this is straight below your feet. And with no plane or anything to block it, we're going to get this color introducing from under here, this color from introducing on top, and these from far off in the distance. Carrara is whoever created this software did a very, very good job at setting this all up. It works really well, and as you can see, it works really fast. Where you'll hear complaints that global illumination is slow, which is true, is that when you get complex scenes. But you don't want to complain that it's slow because it's a complex scene, because Carrara's render engine has an awful lot to do when it's calculating global illumination. It just does it extremely fast. So when you have a simple scene like this, you can take advantage of that wonderful speed. Now, We could turn on indirect lighting right now, but it's not going to make a difference. Not a good one anyway, and I'll explain why. This distant light is an arrow, and the light is traveling from the center of this cylinder in the back through the center of this point in the front, and it's an infinite light, and it's not just infinite in direction this way, but it's also infinite in parallel rays going infinite direction, traveling in the direction of this arrow. Ray tracing is casting rays according to this light, and since this is a distant light, it's casting an awful lot of rays for this light. Whenever a ray from this light touches another object, it looks at that shader and determines how much of a light emitter this object is now going to become for that particular ray. And the ray tracing engine will determine the angle at which that light travels once it reflects off of this surface. So in order to take advantage of indirect lighting and have it be a useful thing, you need things for light to reflect off of and become, basically light emission objects. So let's go ahead and insert an infinite plane. Now right away we have a reason to turn on indirect lighting, and go ahead and shoot a test render. Not the best example in the world, because this infinite plane is so similar in color to what we have for a background. I think this one's done. So now if we turn off indirect light and render in new window, you can see the difference that the indirect lighting has made to this fella. In this situation, with such a simple scene setup and so much light with so little to do with it, I'm actually liking this effect a little bit better. There's some blackness that I don't like, and see, that's where the indirect lighting really helps to take that away. But we have this all set up with global illumination, and we have a single light. Here is where it's fun to just play with the rotation of this light and determine how you want your shadows to look. That is very important to get down to get your scenes the way you want. Shadows are really helpful to have, and then it's what you do with the stuff that's in shadow that makes the difference. So what you want to do for making more dramatic looking renders is to get that shadow in there, where I'll go back, and when you face this pretty much in the same direction as the camera, you're going to notice that you're not going to have any hideous shadows, because you're not going to have much for shadows at all. Okay, you're getting some defining here, so it's helping some, but you're not getting what you should be getting with such wonderful software. What you really want is to build a whole artistic look because of the shadow. And now that's where this global illumination is helping big time, because it's filling in the shadow with color. If we take away that color, it's making our global illumination angry too. Look at that, what the global illumination does though. Oh my, that is just sweet. You take away this global illumination. Oh, I'm using indirect as well. That's why it took a little bit just then. You might not really like that. Let's say that that is the effect you're looking for. That's where you want the shadows, but you don't like it quite as stark. come in your effects and enable your soft shadows. And if you want to make it really small, you want to crank this up somewhat high. 100 really isn't very high. It's not a very soft shadow. Let's try something more like 500. Only go with really super soft shadows if that's not the sun, or it's not a close-up light or anything like that. For something that you want to portray as the sun or a really powerful direct light, you'd want to keep this a little bit more sharp. That's the light radius I'm talking about. As far as the lower the number, the sharper it is. If you turn off soft shadows, then they're really sharp. But look at how much faster it is. When you're painting and just checking it out, I prefer to not use the soft shadows because you can really see what's going on. When you're experimenting with this setup, try not to go for a particular look. Try looking at all different kinds of things like this, because what it's going to do is give you inspiration for how to build light rigs, either to assist your global illumination or to use instead of your global illumination. And this is a pretty neat rim light right here. Rim light might want to be a little bit less of an effect, but this is neat, playing with the rim light. And when you're doing stuff like this, you might want to make it only affect Genesis, okay? So it's not hitting the infinite plane. That's called light linking. I linked it to Genesis, otherwise I can unlink it from Genesis. So if you hear me talking about linking, that's what I'm talking about. Let's say I like that and I want to keep that in there, and now I want to add on to that. Now I'm just going to, for one, I'm going to make that a little bit more intense. Let's bring that up. Yeah. Okay, now let's grab that light and I'm going to Control D to duplicate it. I'm going to call it light 2. Yeah, actually I should change that. Rim light. And now with light 2, let's come over this way, come from above, and somewhere right in there. I'm not shooting for a specific angle, even though if you read lighting books and take lighting exercises, they have good angles to go by. But for this experiment, what I want you to do is try all kinds of different things, and basically what I'm trying to do is light from the other side that the rim light is affecting, so I don't diminish what that light is doing. Now I'm just going to experiment with different things from here, and I'll start from coming up from the top, because it looks like that's what's going to be really effective and cool. And and it's too bright right now. So I'll bring that down to 100 again, because I want to make shadows, so I want a lot of light, and I can always lower it later. And see, now I'm getting that rim and this. Let's shut the rim off. And see how he's just, wherever he's in shadow, he's lost. That's the purpose of a rim light. We turn that on, and now you catch the definition of the shape of the figure, and it's fantastic. It really looks nice, and we've got some really nice shadows going on here. So let's see what the rest of the light rig would be doing, unless of course we wanted that dramatic blackness. And if his skin was white like that, if this was a clay guy like that would be a good picture, I imagine, depending on what you're going for, I guess. And now we don't have anything in the background, so it's not going to make much difference with our global illumination. But so let's do what we have been doing and use the bigradient just as the default, and see what the global illumination can do with that. And now just for sake, we're not looking at shadows underneath the figure. I'm gonna get rid of that for now and look at this again. And now we have our bi-gradient set up with the default setup, which is an outdoor sky pretty much. So let's say we wanted to change this to something more like inside of a cave or something, so I could maybe add a reddish brown in here, or maybe even get it a little closer to green, somewhere in between. It's kind of a muddy but yet kind of dark kind of thing. Or maybe there's torchlight in there. So you can play around with this kind of stuff and maybe make this one a bright yellow because of some torch or whatever. And then from underneath, we don't really want anything from underneath, but just to add some drama to it, let's make it like an intense or not so intense kind of blue. And then just take a look at it, see what we've come up with. And you see what I'm talking about. I'm not using any lights. I'm not coloring the lights. Those lights are both white. All I'm doing is using the global illumination and the background setting of bi-gradient to color the scene. So I noticed that that's way too much there. Let's bring it more in there. And now this isn't exactly the color. Your white to black along here is the intensity range, and your white to full color here is your saturation range. And then here is full color mixed with intensity. So you can have full intensity at full color or low intensity at full color. And then this is high intensity at full color, high intensity at far less saturation, and then bringing it in here will intermix it. So basically play with that. Okay, and let's bring this one into blue range as well and leave it dark like that. Now let's bring a little bit more light in. Okay, maybe now we're getting a little too much blue, so maybe we should leave that background one in blue and maybe make this one more green and maybe even a little less saturated. No, we want kind of saturation. This is the one we'll make brown. And this one we'll make kind of a sickly green and muted. Okay, and then this is going to be too much changes to do in one thing, but now I'm going to bring this brightness down just a little. And you see how we're working this? It's kind of neat. And you can only go so dark because we've got this global illumination on, and we can turn that down and play some more. So very interesting stuff. Now let's crank this back up to something that you may not want it white, but now we're looking at shadows, and I don't even think we have them at soft. They're not even at soft shadows, and look at how nice that looks. So there's the fun. Now let's get rid of this, and let's get rid of this, and we'll instead use the atmosphere of the realistic sky. Might as well leave ground enabled. Why not? You could always disable that. Let's look inside, and I'm going to actually get out of that right away, and I'm going to change light 2 into a sunlight. There it is. Okay, which automatically zeroes it in more ways than one. It's now a completely zeroed. It didn't change this, but it goes to. As a matter of fact, I think if you have this set, that'll stick. But all of these in here get changed to a default whenever you change light types like that. For example, if I change this to 239 and now I switch this to spotlight, you see it goes back to a default setting. And now if I go back to sunlight, if I hit undo, okay, I'm gonna go undo because I didn't want it to change size like that. I must have accidentally tapped a key or something. But okay, so now I've got a sunlight and I've got a realistic sky and I have global illumination turned on and I have ground enabled, so I can actually use this indirect light and it should use the ground. As a matter of fact, I'll change this infinite plane and I'll select this texture here for the infinite plane, and up in multi-channel in the top shader up here I'm going to select lighting models and shadow catcher. Okay, and now I can make it visible and it should be invisible. It doesn't look invisible, so I'm going to make it look more invisible. I'll change the color to none. I'll change highlight to none. And I come through and I none all of this stuff, but now I'm just wasting time. But it's important to know this kind of stuff. It's why have the render engine calculate stuff that we're not going to use. Efficiency. Now let's just see what happens here. And what I wanted to point out with the real, by saying that now we have the realistic sky is, now let's set this sunlight to come from behind as well. And with the realistic sky enabled and you have a sunlight in your scene, you'll see this icon if the sun is going to appear in the scene. So that's handy. You can get pretty precise, and a lot of people don't like it that big, so they go into scene settings, edit, and change this down to 10 or 20 or 15% or something like that, and it makes that icon much smaller. And there's the sun. Now you can add flare to it if you like. A lot of times if I don't want a flare, but I do want some kind of an effect on there, I use this one. I go to glint, which is a blue glint. Now if we look at it, it's like that blue glint, but for the sun I change this blue to yellow and yellowish orange, and you see I'm leaving this whole part alone and just changing where this little circle is in here. And then this blue still looks neat because that's just the outer effect. So we can crank that in, and then from there, if you want, you can make it bigger or smaller or more intense. So that's all up to you. And then, of course, I think I did make it a little bit too small. So we're going to edit this and go to, let's say 25. Okay. Now, let's take a render and see what the global illumination is doing. Is giving us some information from the sky. Very, very cool, don't you think? It's not a good render. I mean, that's not something that you want to keep. But I'm basically just applauding the global illumination at this point. And perhaps if you were to increase these settings it might just, turn out a little bit better. Not so much. You can also play with the global illumination settings, oops, in here, using global brightness. Oh, did I go and turn this down? I did. Let's crank that all the way up, or maybe even go a little bit beyond. We'd have to change the name of this, but we can use this thing to come in and make a bit of a key light setup. Oh, I know why that's black like that, is because I have a shadow catcher on an infinite plane. You shouldn't ever do that to an infinite plane. Um, so basically I'm going to set that to you know what, I'm going to delete that. That's enough for this tutorial. Basically all I wanted to do is touch on using this system. It's free. With every purchase of Carrara is a very powerful setup, and to tell you the truth, I very seldom have played with distant fog and cloudy fog, or the old sky, and perhaps that might work great for certain types of rendering like toon or whatever, but right now let's just use a regular sunlight, put our rim light back to a rim light position, something like that, and do a quick test on that, see what we get. Lots of light. Oh, that's right, I still have this set to high. I like to just use low settings like that, even if I get funky effects. I like to see the funky effects if I'm going to get them. And see that and that's that whole blackness there. That was because of the fact that I had an infinite plane in there. Alrighty, so have fun, dig in, play around with some of this stuff. There's improved edges, light through transparency, show photon map, all this kind of stuff that you can play with. But what I am most interested in when I'm playing with this kind of stuff is what kind of lighting we can do with just one light. Here I have two in here just to show some more examples, but what we were doing with just one light is really quite amazing. And like I say, don't go for just what you were originally thinking. Don't go for a specific thought all of the time. Try doing that, definitely do that, but then also try out other things that differ from that. You might be amazed at the outcome. It's just fun stuff. That's the other thing about shrinking the sun too small, is that you can make it too small for the actual image that shows up in your sky. All right, that's it for now, and we'll catch you later.